Hey everyone, today we're going to be talking about a fairy tale category that is not one of my favorites, but I feel like people still should learn and know about, which is fairy tales about taming a shrewish wife. Because there's enough that that's a thing. If that makes you think of Taming of the Shrew by William Shakespeare, don't worry, we're going to talk about that. Shrew is an offensive word applied to a woman who argues a lot, is easily annoyed, or is opinionated. This is a shrew, this cute little mole-like mammal here. That's not where the word comes from. It's from the Middle English shrew, S-H-R-E W-E, which means an evil or scolding person. There's evidence of it being used to describe either gender in the 13th century, but after the 14th century on, it is applied solely to women. Let's get into our first story by the Brothers Grimm, King Thrushbeard. Starts out with this king who has a daughter who is a shrew because she won't marry anyone, because no one's good enough for her. She says that guy's too fat, that guy's too pale. Finally, this king asks for her hand, and she makes fun of his pointed chin and says that his chin reminds her of a thrush, like the beak of a bird, and she calls him King Thrushbeard. Dad says, I'm so sick of you, I'm gonna make you marry the first beggar who comes to the palace. And he does. Traveling minstrel shows up at the palace, says, I want to marry your daughter, and he's like, cool, take her. And the princess obviously does not want to go, but she is forced to go with this man. As they travel to his home, they pass through King Thrushbeard's kingdom, and she sees how beautiful it is, and she's like, oh man, maybe I was a little too hasty about that. They get to his home, and he's like, all right, we both have to work for a living. You've never been taught how to work in your life because you're a princess, but you're going to be a commoner now. You have to weave. He even makes her sell pots in the marketplace, and a drunken soldier comes by and smashes all of the pots. So she fails at everything because she doesn't know how to do anything because she was raised a princess, and eventually he's like, well, I can't do anything with you to make money. You're just going to have to go work as a servant in the kitchen of King Thrushbeard. She gets hired as a kitchen maid. She basically eats scraps. She works hard all day. She brings the scraps home and shares them with her husband every night. The story doesn't mention the marital bed, but I mean, if he's making her do all this stuff and they are legally married, there's no way that he's also not demanding that legal right of his that she certainly would not be consenting to, but the story doesn't say that specifically, but I mean, yeah. One night it's announced King Thrushbeard is getting married and she has to work the kitchen and she's watching everyone party. And then suddenly King Thrushbeard comes, grabs her, forces her to dance with him, sending the jar of leftovers she's holding for her dinner, like breaking onto the floor and making the entire ballroom laugh at her. She's so upset, she runs away humiliated, but the king follows her and reveals, I've actually been the minstrel the whole time. He was also disguised as the drunken soldier who broke all of her pots, and everything he put her through to humiliate her and make her miserable was to punish her for being mean and teach her a lesson. And she says, oh, thank you, I learned my lesson. And then they get married and she's a princess and they live happily ever after. Now, the thing about King Thrushbeard, though, is that that's the only one in which it ends that way, in which the guy who's taming the shrew is a good guy who gets rewarded. But in the next two tales I'm going to talk about, it's still about an obstinate girl getting humbled, but the guy who's doing the stuff to her is a bad guy, and she doesn't end up with him, so they're better. The first and oldest one is Cannetella by Basile. It's an Italian story. Again, she doesn't want to get married, and so to get out of it, she says, I'll only marry someone who has golden teeth and golden hair. And so this wizard hears about that, and so he transforms himself to have golden teeth and golden hair, and she has to marry him because she said she'd do that. So he takes her to a stable, and he says, you have to live here with the horses and only eat what the horses leave left over, and you're not allowed to leave. I mean, basically starves her and puts her in prison. One day she sneaks out to this garden that's outside and eats some grapes, and he's like, I'm gonna kill you for this. And she begs for her life, and he's like, all right, I'll give you one more chance. And she has to keep being imprisoned and eating the horse food that's left over. But then a royal locksmith, while this evil dude's out one day, stops by and she calls to him, persuades him it's her because he knows her from the palace, even though she looks horrible now, and he rescues her. And her father protects her. He's like, oh my God, I'm so sorry you got married to an evil wizard. And the wizard comes after her and they hide her behind 7 iron doors. He brides an old woman to go to the palace under the guise of selling rouge to put this magical piece of paper under Cannetella's pillow, and once she does, everyone but Cannetella just falls magically asleep. So the wizard comes in, bursts through the doors, picks her up, and he's about to take her off, but the paper falls out from under the pillow, and once it lands on the floor, everyone wakes up. And then they all pounce on him and cut him into pieces. And that's the awesome ending of this story. So of course I saved the weirdest for last, and this one is a fairy tale from Spain called The Hunchback. Starts out the same, girl won't marry anyone, and she one day is also really mean to this old hunchback beggar who asks her for money. So he puts a flea on her, and she's like, I've never seen a flea before. So she thinks it's interesting and takes it home and puts it in a jar. She feeds it milk until it becomes too fat for its prison, and then she orders it killed and skinned and made into a bracelet. Rather, made into a small drum that gets put inside a bracelet. So then she tells her dad, all right, I'll marry anyone who can guess what is inside my bracelet that rattles when I shake it, because who's gonna guess that? So all these kings and princes try to guess until one comes along that's very handsome and she likes him and she wants him to get it. And so she like goes on her balcony one night and she's like, there's a flea in my bracelet, hoping he'll hear. But that beggar dude who gave her the flea hears, and so he's like, mwahaha. So he comes in, guesses right, and he's like, all right, guess you're mine now, and carries her off. And her dad's mean about it. He's like, go off with your husband. I hope you forget you even have a father. So they're traveling to his home and they get to a river and he's like, you have to carry me on your back because I say so. And so she does, but then when they get in the middle of the river, she tries to shake him off because she can't handle it anymore. But he starts coming off in fragments. His legs fall off, his arms fall off, his head falls off until he's all gone except for the hump, which fastens itself to her back, and now she's got the hump. And she realizes anytime she speaks, the hump echoes her in a mimicking voice. Like, stop copying me, the hump talks. So she quits talking and tells everyone she's mute and walks around begging for food. So she comes to the kingdom of that first prince that she liked, gets a job in the kitchen, and he sees her and thinks she's beautiful, and he literally says to himself, if she were not a hunchback and a mute, I'd marry her. Apparently those are his two deal breakers. So the time comes, the prince is gonna marry a princess, a different princess, and she's of course really jealous and sad, and she's frying up pancakes, and she talks to her hump and says, hey hump, you want some pancakes? And the hump is the hump of an old man who likes sweets, so it says, yes, I would. And she says, well then jump in my pocket. And it jumps off her back, and she has planned this. She already has tongs, and she grabs it with the tongs and puts it in boiling oil. She melts it into a lump of lard that presumably does not talk anymore. She goes and shows the prince, look, I don't have a hump anymore. Also, I can talk. And he's like, cool, I'm gonna marry you instead of this chick. And he does. So Shakespeare's Taming of the Shrew follows some of the same shrew taming methods. Marries her against her will. He starves her. He makes her agree with everything he says, like saying that the sun is the moon and the moon is the sun. All this psychological torture, and it ends with her being the most obedient wife of all. Lots of Shakespeare scholars, particularly women, like to read it in a different way, that she's not really tamed, that there's like nuance to it. I don't like it because I find it hard to see that. And you know I love musicals. And even though I like some of the songs, one of the musicals I don't like is Kiss Me Kate, which this actual poster from the movie version in the 50s shows this guy spanking this girl, that she's the shrew. He's taming her. That's actually what ends Act 1, is him spanking the crap out of her. I obviously don't need to point out that with these stories, there's not a male equivalent. There are no stories about young men who are too headstrong and obstinate and need to be humbled through torture and starvation. Is there sexism in almost every fairy tale? Yeah. Is sexual assault a plot device that is completely normalized and even rewarded in a bunch of them? Oh yeah. But I think they're worth looking at, it definitely worth recognizing, because they say something about our history and our culture, and they can be relatable now. Just 100 years ago in this country, America, it was still completely legal to beat and sexually assault your wife. In my mother's lifetime, women couldn't get credit cards or open a bank account in their own name. And there has yet to be a female president of this country. Here you're getting political. I'm just stating facts. And the main fact that I'm getting to is there are still men in this country who would see stories like this as good stories to teach young women. But the good news is that looking at it, facing that fact back then where we are now, is the only way to ever actually change it. Because stories are how we learn about ourselves and how we can implement change in the future. And I'll die on that hill. On that happy note, I have a podcast where I discuss fairy tales in more depth than I do here on TikTok. The link is in my bio. And you could check out my book, Dust Spells by Andrea Lynn, which is a retelling of another fairy tale, The 12 Dancing Princesses. And it's got a better message than King Thrushbeard. So